check, and I'm going to pass it off to you guys.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. So I just wanted to say thank you, Carol, for setting this up, and really through your leadership at CPOA, I think we're doing something that's really needed and contemporary to what we're all going through. And before I defer to Dan, what we're going to talk about today really is what our temporary operations procedures that we're doing right now within our organizations, and kind of going into a variety of topics that I think we're all dealing with, but we may not be dealing with the same way. So I know preparing for this yesterday, Santa Cruz is doing things much differently than the city of Beverly Hills is, by way of enforcement and some of the closures that they're doing that we're not doing, or that we're doing that they're not doing. So I think it's going to be a good discussion, and we look forward to the participation from the group. I really think that the value of this is to let it be organic some way, somehow, and really get some good feedback from everyone else. So with that, I will defer to Dan.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Again, Carol and the CPOA, thank you for hosting this. Yeah, really how this all came about is when this whole pandemic started and there were so many questions, I think the first concern at my department was for my staff. I mean, how are my staff reacting? Do they feel like they're supported by the department? And what is management, or what does the administration do to put mitigations in place? And so early on, we kind of had two options. And I'm curious, this will be a question for kind of the group too, is like, there's two options. One, you can kind of run everything by email and just a day-to-day update, or you could kind of create a SOP manual, so to speak, or some procedures. So we very early on decided to go ahead and create a manual. It's now up to like 44 pages, but that includes some of the health orders that have come out in our county and some of the changes there. But part of this, and what I hope with this conversation is, yes, in talking to Marc yesterday about what Beverly Hills is doing, and part of my reaching out to CPOA is, I think all of us are kind of pulling ideas or pulling responses from information that we're getting, but then we're trying to manage it for our individual agencies, and kind of coming down to like, hey, what are we doing across the state? And my real reason for kind of sending our SOP to CPOA to review with Sean was, what am I missing? What is there something? Is there some idea out there that's happening that's not occurring? And so I guess kind of the first thing I'd like to ask is, how many different agencies out there have an actual kind of a formal SOP regarding this, or are you kind of just, is it kind of through email or other processes there? So I'll give you a few seconds if you can just see a poll question asking up, and you go ahead and answer that for us. I can tell you, so my agency does have like I said, it's up to like 44 pages now with daily updates that kind of go out, not every day, but things change with the courts, they change with the jails as far as what our jail, our jail is not even accepting nonviolent felony arrests anymore. So you've got to come up with mitigations for that. But realistically, our first priority kind of came with how do we prepare our staff? I mean, what PPE do they have? When are we going to make it mandatory? And I see a question there as far as if you do want to look at our SOP, then I will reach out. I did send it to CPOA. They're more than happy to share it. But again, I would ask that if you do look at it and there's something that we're missing, please share it back so that we can make adjustments as we go. So real quickly, not to take all of this time, but looking at our SOP, we really kind of focused on the PPE, when were we going to mandate it, what were exposure mitigations. One of the things we did very early on was we kind of made a gel in, gel out. So every time somebody's out in the field, they have to come in, and either we put wash stations outside the building, gel stations everywhere. And then we also put in kind of a mandatory decon of our building. What that means is every section in our building, normally this is not duties that are assigned to police officers or records technician or property clerks, but we basically said, hey, 3 times a shift, we're providing bleach and cleaning solution. You're going to clean and wipe down your area, and the sergeant's actually assigned. So those are some of the initial measures we took into place. And then, you know, again, scheduling, calls for service, mitigation, as a chief from Beverly Hills said that, you know, our community at first was, even with shelter in place enforcement, it kind of went from we're just doing education and then engaging the community. And then we really started receiving a lot of pushback from the community of, hey, we're all sheltering in place. We're a tourist town. Everybody's coming here and kind of hanging out at our beach and violating the shelter in place. We want you to do enforcement. And so we kind of got encouraged by the community to push into that. So, and again, I see a lot of questions out there as far as if people want a copy of our procedure manual, more than willing to share it. Just, again, provide me some feedback. And with that, Mark, I'll let you add some.
Thanks, Dan. Carol, can you hear me okay? Okay. So similar to Dan, what we did is we created our temporary standard operating procedures, and we're up to 11 now. And really the focus was to keep our employees healthy and really provide assistance and serve our community. We wanted to be very visible in the community. We wanted them to have a sense of security while we were dealing with this pandemic. And then we wanted to continuously communicate to our constituencies and our communities served, and then really support the local emergency operations center. So the city of Beverly Hills has a state-of-the-art emergency operations center. Then clearly we're working with Los Angeles County and with the federal government, just like everyone else is. And really to kind of, I would be more than happy to share our SOP with everybody as well. Looking at the poll, it looks like the about 71% of us wanted to compare and contrast how we're doing the enforcement efforts within our communities. I can tell you for the city of Beverly Hills, and it'll be a good dialogue between Dan and I, because it is a difference of 2 communities. So in Beverly Hills, we're just doing complete community education right now. We're not doing any enforcement. We're not issuing any citations, even though we have passed a local emergency ordinance to allow us to do that. It really is more of a community education piece. However, the highest amount of calls for service we're getting right now are people calling in on other people who are not wearing their masks. So we're getting to the point now where we probably will start some enforcement pieces. And maybe that's why people are still doing that, because there's no citations being issued. But our thoughts right now is see if we can educate the community, knowing that probably a good amount of people that we'd be given tickets to have recently lost their jobs. They're struggling with their own issues with the pandemic, and we're trying not to build on top of what they're already struggling with emotionally and physically. So Dan, tell us what you're doing in Santa Cruz.
So again, yeah, our kind of our terminology initially with this shelter in place, and I want to thank Jim Touchstone, who's on here, because I know he provided some kind of some legal guidance out there. But our first kind of term was, you know, we were going to educate through social media and a bunch of information. Then we were going to engage when we started getting these calls, when businesses were reporting on businesses, and then eventually go to enforcement. We lasted in the education phase for about a week, and then engagement lasted, and then it really ramped up where the community was again saying, hey, what are you doing? So here's a couple of things that we did. First, we stuck to the health and safety code. The 120275 is what we're for a violation of our county's shelter in place order. That kind of mirrors what the state was doing. But you know, as we started, like just recently, we shut down our surf spots and our parks, just kind of like LA County did. And next thing you know, cops are chasing surfers out of the water. And again, hitting a number of the population that we normally don't contact and conduct enforcement action. And so there was, you know, trying to get the patrol staff kind of over that, that hump was, you know, that is a challenge. But one of the things we did is, instead of like going after the pure misdemeanor violations that could potentially put something on somebody's criminal history, we worked with our city attorney and our city manager. And being a charter city, our city manager actually passed an executive order based upon what's already on our municipal code, which I'm sure most jurisdictions have some sort of an emergency situation, emergency exit executive order that your city manager can pass. They passed that. It didn't have to go to council. He passed this executive order basically saying that what the county health officer has ordered, we're in placing in our city, and therefore our city muni codes that are applicable could be enforced. What that did is it opened up other municipal code avenues for us that were actually less, I think, impactful in some aspects. So like our parks and beaches were closed. Instead of going with the health and safety shelter in place, we just did closed beaches or closed parks, which depending on how that, if we've had refusal or whatever that engagement was. So it kind of helped lower, it kind of increased actually some of our officers' willingness or officers' ability to think, okay, that sounds reasonable to me to go do that level of enforcement. And then also there's a section under there that is an infraction for violating an executive order. So we're still using the misdemeanor code. It just depends. If we have people, like just recently we had, the other night, we had some people come over that started a fight in our parking lot. They came from out of the area, and we conducted some enforcement on them. And I think due to the additional charges being filed or potentially being filed, they were charged with the misdemeanor. So those are some of the options. There's other legal enforcement codes that we haven't used ever, and that is one of the biggest crimes that has come up in our city is commercial burglary. Since this, all of our business districts are shut down. So we actually looked at looting sections for those committing burglaries, and in one 2-night period or 3-night period, arrested 7 commercial burglaries in progress, which is kind of, for my jurisdictions, kind of unheard of that you actually catch that many people in the act. But worked on additional those kind of unusual codes that we don't normally enforce, and worked on those enforcement. So that's kind of what we're doing in Santa Cruz.
You know, Dan, we talked about this yesterday. It is a good compare and contrast, because we're seeing our burglaries have been reduced by almost 40%, and that is all encompassing of the burglary statute. But what we're seeing is Rodeo Drive, right? One of the most prolific streets in the world, that all these businesses are boarding up their businesses almost like they're expecting a riot or looting or something to happen in our community. And what it is, it's, you know, we're trying to communicate to them that you're safe, right? The community is safe. You don't need to board it up. So really the enforcement piece now that we're doing is code enforcement is reaching out to those property owners to go after them legally, because they can't board up their businesses in town by city statute. So it's just interesting to see that. And then Carol is going to put up 2 questions for our audience. And really, we want to see what crime up or down in your community, and is calls for service up or down in your community. And then lastly, have you adopted to some type of modified schedule for patrol? And then lastly, is, does your department have an employee that has tested positive for COVID-19? So let's give about 30 seconds and see how we're doing with that.
While we're waiting for that, there's a question that was posted about if anybody's been experiencing street racing during the shelter in place, and asking specifically about the violation codes. So I'll kick that back to you, but that may be an area where Jim Touchstone wants to weigh in as well.
I see. I can't hear Jim talking, but I will say we have not seen, as far as the street racing crime, we have not seen that. And as far as the enforcement code for the shelter in place, the section we've been using is 120275. Is that right? No, I'm confused now. But so there's that section that we're using that's pretty much been posted across a lot of material coming from different sources.
Hey, Carol, does the poll tell you how many people participated in it?
Yes, it does. It did while it was polling. This was about half the people that are on the call at the moment.
Okay, 13, 15, what's our number?
We have 22 participants, so it was a little bit higher than that actually.
Okay.
So this is the first set, and let me know when you want me to put out the second set of questions.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and put out, are you talking about the modified schedules? Have you put that poll out yet?
Yeah, that's this one. That was 50-50.
Okay, gotcha.
And hi, Carol, this is Jim Touchdown. Can you folks hear me?
Yep.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm having a lot of technical issues today for some reason. I tried to join with my computer audio and that was ineffective. So with respect to the street racing question, my thoughts on that would be to stick to the vehicle code sections. They're going to be a little bit more familiar to the criminal prosecutors as well as your respective officers. We're all unfortunately kind of treading in uncharted waters with respect to a lot of these health and safety code sections, and even the government code section 8665, which concerns enforcement of the executive orders. Dan, I liked your approach that you're taking in Santa Cruz as far as attempting to control behavior by use of your municipal code provisions. That does a couple of things for you. That allows your city attorney's office to kind of control the prosecution and make some discretionary decisions. Whereas if you're citing for some of these other health and safety code sections and so forth, once that gets in the DA's office's hands, it's kind of out of your control to a certain extent. So, and they're generally going to be easier to prove. I mean, if, for example, somebody is in a park, when the park is posted as closed, it's very easy on the proof elements that you would have to establish. So, hope that helps.
Yeah, hey, thank you for that. I think it does help because, you know, we, again, it is easier to, in a lot of these things to defend that a park being closed, that's posted closed. And again, I do also think it was easier, while I have excellent men and women working here that are very dedicated, it's very easier for them to like kind of focus on those more tangible violations and kind of some of these bigger questions like, well, can they be out in the public, you know, if they're driving and all these other questions that come out that there's some confusion related to these different shelter in place orders and what's kind of statewide and then what is actually individualized by each county public health officer.
Okay, so looking at our poll, you know, it seems pretty consistent, at least with Southern California, I can comment on, where not a lot of agencies are having employees that are catching the COVID-19, which is awesome. And then it's about 50-50. A lot of departments are staying status quo with their schedules, where we in the city of Beverly Hills did something, you know, real dramatic, right? We went on basically kind of like a 1 week on, 2 weeks off kind of schedule to keep our employees as healthy as we can. And you know, there was a lot of challenges with that, both fiscally and optically with the department and the community, but we were able to work through that. And then you know, really with the what was the third question, Carol? I'm trying to pull it up.
It was, let's see, let me go back to that. You had, has any agencies tested positive? Three have 11 of the respondents. It was 21% versus 71% no. 50-50 on modified schedules, and a 64% drop in crime.
Right. So that's was the big thing. I mean, we're seeing huge reductions in crime and huge reduction in calls for service. What we are seeing is a lot of people calling in wanting to have COVID-19 questions asked and answered. And, you know, just like your communities have, we created a hotline to defer all those calls, but about 75% of our calls are COVID related calls. And I'm curious, for everybody on the call, if they're seeing the same kind of COVID-19 calls and if they're tracking them. Dan, how you guys doing in Santa Cruz?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot more. So one of the things we did is we did go on a 12-hour schedule, but when we went on that schedule, we did it mostly not because, so we went on a straight 12, 7 to 7 shift, and an A-B split. So we're not creating any time as far as distancing. The reason we went to 12s is to put more officers in the field, and we did two things with it. One, we did burglary suppression mitigation because our commercial burglaries were going up. So we've got at least 2, if not 4, unmarked units out at any time that are basically just doing burglary suppression. And that's how we're catching some of these burglars. Either they're in the act or somebody prowling in the area. And then the other officers that added to our staff, we allowed to, they're kind of taking on some of those shelter in place calls instead of, so we have our beat officer assignments, and then we have some extra staff out there to kind of mitigate some of these calls. And it's been fairly successful for us. And thankfully, like I'm seeing on the poll, we haven't had anybody, we've had at 1.7 officers sick out, but not, we're about 100 sworn. So not a huge impact. And we haven't had anybody test positive. So, so we did a little bit different model, put all these mitigations so people hopefully do not get sick or get exposed, and then even limited our calls. I'm sure most jurisdictions are doing. There are so many more calls that we are making phone contact prior to making any face-to-face contact, and that we are even on some of our DOA calls, we noticed a little spike one week, which was concerning, but we were able to kind of put some measures in place instead of officers getting right there and even running in with fire. There's a lot of pre-screening calls go in, making sure that we have phone contact with somebody that's in the residence to even pre-screen again prior to potential exposure. And so that's kind of what our staffing model has allowed us to do with some of these extra bodies.
Hey, Jim, regarding the HIPAA stuff, I know the federal government relaxed some of the restrictions on that. Are we able to put a premise history on a house that there's somebody who has tested positive or maybe even passed away from COVID-19? I know we get that question a lot.
Yes, Mark, I believe that you can, based on the guidance we've received from the federal government on the issue. And specifically, I think departments still need to take measures to protect the confidentiality of somebody's medical history to the extent they can. So, for example, our office put out a client alert on this issue. Tagging a specific location, I think, is fine, so long as you're using some form of encrypted communication with the officers via dispatch, either your MDCs and or if you have encrypted radio channels to provide that information, I think is appropriate. But putting out a list, department-wide of these are addresses and names is not something that I would certainly recommend. In sum and substance, those restrictions have been relaxed to a certain extent, but nevertheless, the overarching premise of that is try to maintain confidentiality when you can within the scope of what your officers as first responders are doing.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So on the poll, and this isn't going to be rocket science, everybody's working with their county health systems, in one way or another. So Jason Winger put something up on the chat. So we asked what people are doing, and they're doing 3 on and 6 off with a 12.5-hour shift. And that's a big change for them because they are normally a 410 team. So it looks like another example of an agency, really reaching out of their comfort zone to keep their officers safe while still being able to police their community. Dan, one thing I wanted to talk about was, we talked about the dispatch center, the communication center, how key they are with our responses. Are you guys doing any type of COVID-19 questionnaire when the calls come in to put your fire department and your police department in the very best place possible when they arrive?
Yeah, we're doing two things. And again, Jim, thanks for putting out legal clarification. We actually shared that with, I'm not sure if other jurisdictions are having this problem. We even shared that with our public health officer, who's still kind of reluctant to release that information even to our dispatch center. And so just not, I'll answer your question, but the part of what we're doing is then kind of keeping an internal list, because we are going out to residences and finding out that, oh, we get there and you know, mom has COVID and there's this other family problem, say, that we're dealing with. And so we're trying to flag that address internally because we're not getting it from our dispatch center. But our center is, they are doing the screening questions. You know, is anybody there have a fever? Is anybody tested positive? You know, or is there any type of exposure? And then they're providing a message of that officers responding or fire responding should use universal precautions. And that's about it. But as far as truly flagging an address, that's not happening. And it's kind of unfortunate. That's been a little bit of a struggle we've had. And we understand that even if they send it out via MDC, they don't have to put it out over the air. So again, we've kind of had to do an internal process to just at the roll calls, letting them know, hey, just so you know, these addresses were flagged.
And Dan, if I may jump in on that, you're not alone. I've also heard from other jurisdictions where county health officials have been reluctant to share that information, unfortunately, despite the federal government putting out some guidelines saying it was permissible under the current pandemic situation. I'm not quite sure the motivations why, but that being said, you're not alone in that issue. And I think it needs to change, because really, the more armed you are with information as a first responder, the more precautious you can be when approaching a particular location.
Carol, how are we doing on time?
We're about at that mark. So really at this point, I guess you can decide to open it up for any additional questions or anything that hasn't been addressed that people were hoping to get addressed when they called into this call.
I think one thing that I want to talk about, if everybody has about 5 more minutes, is what we're doing for our employees when they come to work and when they leave to work in regards to pre-screening them for the COVID-19. And I can tell you, you know, in Beverly Hills, we're having them self-monitor, take their temperature. We've provided temperature cards, which if you guys haven't seen those, they're a cardboard card that fits inside your wallet that are surprisingly really accurate. We also have different electronic devices when they come in, and you know, the reality of it is I really think that's been helpful, because we've sent a couple people home that have had a little bit of an elevated temperature, and you know, just again erring on the side of caution, and doing really the same thing on the way out, and really reinforcing them wearing their masks, washing their hands, the social distancing, everything that we all know about. So what are you doing, Dan, in Santa Cruz?
Yeah, so we're on their first day back, because we're like, they work a 3/12 and then a 4/12, so they have a 3-day off and a 4-day off. And their first shift back from their weekend, we are mandating that we have thermometers at the back door, so when they come to work, they're supposed to take their temperature. And then the sergeants at their roll calls, or supervisors for records or any other divisions, are also asking just screening questions daily as a start of shifts, like, you know, is anybody homesick? Do you feel sick? And then if somebody's, yeah, you know, my kid has had a cold, then they'll ask them to take their temperature. And that's kind of the pre-screening. That's about all we're doing, but it varies. You know, we have a jurisdiction, we have an agency in my jurisdiction that before you even walk in the building every shift, you have to ask the screening questions. They mandate you take your temperature, and then they actually band you, put a wristband on, so that for the rest of your shift, they know that you've asked those questions. So it's really, and then I have other jurisdictions that are doing nothing, not at all. So it really, it was kind of a big swing. And I think it's really kind of up to the individual agency is kind of what they're comfortable as far as whether they're mandating something or not. And so there is kind of a high spectrum going on there.
So we received a question, Jim, where can I find the information about relaxed HIPAA guidelines? Did you send that out in a client alert, or where can we find that for the group?
Yes, I did, Mark. I sent it out in the client alert, and I believe there was also an embedded link to the HHS memorandum that came out on the issue. Certainly, I can push it out to Carol again as well, though, just to ensure that everyone has it.
Okay, thank you.
I guess the last thing I'll do here is put out your last question about whether throughout all of this conversation, if you're finding that your officers and staff are supportive of how your agencies are responding to this. And I know from a CPOA perspective, you know, one of the main drives for this series was about officer wellness and both physical and mental wellness. So I wonder how much the response of the agencies ties into this question.
Well, I'll answer. You know, I'd like to think, I mean, I'm a chief, I'd like to think everybody's happy with our response, but the reality is really what it came down for us is one, making sure that everybody in management and the supervisors are continually, myself as well, we're making sure that we're really communicating daily with everybody, not just through email, but a lot of face-to-face contact. I've gone to a lot of roll calls just so we're having that conversation. And I really, I've kind of have a sense in my organization that by kind of taking this on, I say our poll's pretty high there about people feeling supportive. I think that's the general sense that I have, that we're taking measures, we're asking total unusual, changing even some of our patrol responses. But as long as we're providing that information and that communication and make sure the information out there, I felt like an overwhelming amount of that the staff really feels, one, that they're supported, that we're taking it seriously, but that there's a why behind every kind of procedural change that we've added. And again, there's been some that we don't like. I mean, when the jail said we can't book felonies that are nonviolent, that's a challenge for us because we've got felons that occur in our city regularly. So how do you mitigate that? And being able to address it through some of the SOPs and then that constant communication, I think, is kind of put a calm over the uncertainty that's out there. But again, I love feedback from the group as well, as far as, you know, what more that they could see or anything that their agency's doing.
So Bill Smizer put up an interesting question here from an investigative standpoint. What has your detective divisions done? Are they reassigned to patrol or nonviolent cases? Are they suspending investigations or allowed to contact witnesses, victims, suspects in the field, or only via phone or email?
So I can answer that from Beverly Hills. We collapsed all of our specialty units and put them into patrol. However, on their, and basically what they're doing is they're working 7 days a week, or excuse me, 7 days a month, and then they are home the rest of the month. However, when they're not on their normal days off, they're telecommuting and working on the cases that specifically to the detectives, they're telecommuting from home. But yeah, I mean, we're suspending cases, the nonviolent cases right now that we just don't have time to do because of the collapse of putting investigations into patrol.
The only thing we've done different is actually we're kind of holding our investigations, and then we have some neighborhood policing teams that are still working, but they're kind of our reserves for if patrol gets really starts to take some impacts, that we can have kind of them as a back and forth. Granted that hopefully they don't get exposed. They are doing a lot more communication via the phone, but you know, we had a gang involved shooting where someone was shot just a week ago. So some of those investigations still have to occur, and they're kind of continuing on that. So anytime we can encourage phone contact, that's been the message from patrol and from investigations.
Okay, well, in respect of everybody's time, I'd like to thank you, Mark and Dan, for participating in this conversation. I will send out their information to everybody who's interested in receiving it, their policies, as long as they're willing to share those, and encourage you to stay in tune with some of these other topics. If there's a topic you would like to hear that we haven't yet addressed, please let me know, because that's the point, is trying to share this information in this very changing times. So with that being said, thank you, be safe, and we will talk to you soon.